So I think we will begin. First of all, I want to thank all of you for being here. We might not be the loudest or largest crowd today, but I don't think that's because this is not a headline-grabbing topic. On the contrary, I think it reflects not just the nice summer weather, but also how much the EU's role in a changing global order has become a topic of debate and concern. So today and this week and these weeks, there is a flurry of events, activities and debates that focuses on the EU as the Danish presidency is just around the corner at a time obviously marked by deep uncertainty, political fragmentation and growing security risks. But while many of these discussions tend to look east and sometimes west, this event will look south, not least towards the Middle East. Sometimes referred to as our southern neighborhood to illustrate how interconnected we are. This is a region where the EU tend to be portrayed as an economic giant, but less of a political actor, and with limited influence on issues related to security. It is an area with political instability, socioeconomic warning signs, and most importantly right now, a brutal war and a humanitarian disaster in Gaza, and most recently, of course, the Israeli attack on Iran, followed by Iranian counterattacks. These are events that are unfolding as we speak, so more things might have happened when we exit this room. But this is, of course, then also a time where we need international diplomacy, not just in the short term, but also more longer term to come up with sustainable solutions. And some would argue, or hope, perhaps, that the EU could and should step up in partnership with regional key actors. So to keep it short, we are seeing changes to global order, but it's less clear what will emerge and what role the EU can and should and will play. However, moving to today's event, I'm very happy to be able to introduce 3 speakers and experts who will enlighten us. First will be Eduard Soler Lecha, I'm sure I Lecha, an associate professor in international relations at the Autonomous University of Barcelona and associate senior researcher at Barcelona's Center for International Affairs, who has worked extensively on EU foreign policy and the Middle East. Second speaker will be Michel Pace, a professor in global studies at Roskilde University and associate fellow at Chatham House's Europe program, who will focus on EU-Palestine relations in her talk. And finally, but not least, Christine Nissen, chief analyst in think tank Europe and a former DIIS colleague. And she's worked extensively on the EU's defense and security policy as well as EU-Sahel relations. We will have all 3 presentations and then a Q&A, so please remember your questions towards the end. And then without further ado, please, Edward.
To me at home, probably, yes, now. I was just thanking this for having me here again. So, and I was telling that it's very important to have these conversations at a European level on the Middle East because there are very different sensitivities, very different perceptions, north, south, east, west. So for me, it's a privilege and an opportunity also to come from the south of Europe, in that sense, from Spain, and to be able to exchange with you all about what the interests, positions, and stakes of the EU are when it comes to the Middle East and North Africa, or the Mediterranean, as we tend also to design it and to name it in Spain, and as I guess also in Malta. So I was saying also it's a pleasure to be here at this because we had the chance to work in my previous employer, set up with this in a big research project which was called Menara on geopolitical shifts in the Middle East and North Africa after the Arab uprisings and the geopolitical implications of this for the EU. So again, it's back to it's nice to be back and to continue this conversation that we initiated already in 2016. When I was first approached to address you, the idea was to discuss the new policies of the EU for the Mediterranean. I've had the chance of being involved in some of the consultation processes that are going on right now on this idea of having a new pact for the Mediterranean. I don't know to what extent you are familiar with this. I'll try to also to brief you a little bit about what I have been briefed. But inevitably, I'll have to combine this element, this idea of the new pact for the Mediterranean, with the more recent pressing developments that are happening in the Middle East right now and how the EU has to position. And that's why, even before I get into this new pact for the Mediterranean, that I wanted to project this image. This image now it's a bit old. It was published in October 2023 in The Economist. Probably you've recognized the layout. So very mainstream media in Charlemagne, which is one of the most read columns on European affairs. And I find this cartoon to be very indicative, very illustrative of what it is going on. Somehow also it echoes a previous cartoon that was published in The Economist, where we saw the Europeans surrounded by a ring of fire. That cartoon was published in 2015. For those that are a little bit more familiar with the European jargon, there was the idea that in this neighborhood that we were referring before, the EU wanted to build a ring of stable, well-governed and prosperous countries. And instead, what the EU realized in 2015 was that it was surrounded, both in the east as well as in the south, by a turbulence and this fire that was getting closer to the EU. So here we have fire again. So the neighborhood is ignited and it's even closer. We see some representatives of the EU, so Ursula von der Leyen, so it's interesting, the president of the Commission, that tells us a lot, because she, in principle she's not competent for foreign policy, but she's very active on foreign policy matters. And two of the leaders, Macron and Olaf Scholz, at that time. And as you may know, one of the promises of Ursula von der Leyen first term was to make the EU and the Commission more geopolitical, and to be ready to play and to speak in a world that had changed, which is also one of the overarching topics that we are discussing. And yet, after the October the 7th attacks by Hamas and the retaliation by Israel, what we were able to witness is a EU that was divided on this, and that was exposed to many contradictions that probably we will be able to discuss at length. So in a way, this idea of a more geopolitical union kind of faded away because of these circumstances. What it means, therefore, is that what happens in the Middle East does not stay in the Middle East. This is not Las Vegas, it is something else. And therefore, what we are discussing here, it is not only about the European policies towards the Middle East, but the role of the EU in the world and in world affairs. This idea of division still, I don't know, how shall I pass the, because I don't see it here, probably. Okay, but no, the screen doesn't show. Probably we need to go to the PowerPoint. Wait.
Can you try this?
Yes. Nope. Otherwise you will stay with this picture all the time.
Something happened.
Try and see what.
It's this one.
Also an impressive example of how we are supposed to be half hybrid, half
Now.
about focus and script or not.
No worries. So basically, I think it was on the 27th of October already, the member states of the EU voted divided in the UN General Assembly when the first calls for a ceasefire were put forward. This idea of division has remained, and this is the latest example. So you could see that was on the 12th of June this year, a few days ago, when just another resolution to protect civilians and uphold legal and humanitarian obligations was not able to be voted by all the members of the EU. We see here a little bit. I mean, you could go and check for the different countries, but basically you will see one European member state, Hungary, that voted against the resolution, a few others that abstained, like the Czech Republic. Most others voted in favor. But then in October 2023 it was even more extreme, and let's say that the countries that voted in favor of the ceasefire were in minority. I think we were 8 countries to vote in that direction. So here, when it comes to how the EU positions towards the Middle East, that's probably the first thing that one needs to take into consideration: division. Probably there is an agreement that this is a relevant area for all of us, that this is an issue of concern. Here I would say that there has been a process of convergence. I remember the conversations we had in the 1990s and in the 2000s, early 2000s, where there was the idea, okay, only the countries from the south care about what happens in the south, only the countries from the east care about what happens in the east. I have the feeling that now there has been some convergence in the idea that there are common interests and common concerns. So it's not a matter that we care or we don't care, it's just that we see things very differently. You may know that in 2012 there was another vote in the UN for the possibility of having Palestine as an associate member state, and at that point the member states were already very divided. And this was a very sensitive topic. One person that was in the room when these issues were being discussed told me an anecdote that I am explaining very often because I think it's very telling about what we have to discuss today. Cathy Ashton, do you remember her? She proposed to all the ministers around to abstain collectively. If there were some that wanted to vote in favor, those that wanted to vote against it. Why don't we abstain so that at least we are united? There is a little bit of the sacrality of unity. And yet, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of one of the smallest countries in Europe, I'm not going to name the person or the country, said, well, you know, before either than abstaining, I prefer to evaporate myself on an issue of this importance. So this is something that we need to identify and not to, I mean, because probably the idea of we have to be united means that we have to be irrelevant. That we will need to agree on the minimum common denominator, and the minimum common denominator probably is to shut up. So that's the first element that I wanted to start with. We have different positions, and we need to learn to manage these divisions. So, understanding that we are disunited, however, there is a minimum agreement that the Middle East and North Africa, the Mediterranean, is an area of strategic priority for the EU. And there are some new elements here. The first one is that there is, for the first time, a commissioner whose task and whose job is to build and strengthen a Mediterranean policy for the EU. Croatian lady, Commissioner Lecha, I don't know if you are aware. And she has a main task if you read the letter of mission sent by Ursula von der Leyen, she has been tasked to prepare and present to us all in October a new pact for the Mediterranean. That, in a way, will complement, I'm not saying replace, because probably it's based on all what we already have, but a new vision for the EU on the Mediterranean. There is a new direction general. So this whole idea of the neighborhood, it's no longer there. We have two neighborhoods, and there are two different direction generals. And what has changed the most is the context. The context is more dangerous than ever before. Even more dangerous probably until in 2015. Probably we are in a moment of unprecedented turbulences when it comes to the region and the effects for the EU. This is what I would say what it is new. What it is not new is the idea that the EU needs a policy towards this region, even if we are disunited, if we have different sensitivities, but there is a sense of an agreement that if the EU is not able to have a policy for this region, it means that it is an irrelevant political actor. You can take the Middle East, the Mediterranean, as a litmus test for the agency and for the actorness of the EU, and we can date it back already to 1973. And I think that also started in Copenhagen with the launch of the Euro-Arab dialogue. Whenever, and then afterwards the European political cooperation, so it was the embryo of the European foreign policy, the Middle East had always been there at the very beginning, when the EU had to show that it was an actor able to have its own policies, having resources to apply it, and being recognized by the other relevant actors as such. So this hasn't changed. It has always been a litmus test of the EU's agency and actorness. It is still now, and we will have the opportunity to discuss it. The second is also and this is not new, that there is a clear connection between what happens in Israel, in the Middle East, in Palestine, and the overall Mediterranean policy of the EU. When in 1995 the EU was able to launch what it was called the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, it was because there was hope, because there was the possibility to think about a comprehensive peace for the Middle East, and in a way this Euro-Mediterranean dimension was also part of the European contribution to it. And then obviously when the Middle East peace process, or the so-called Middle East peace process, stalled, then basically we saw also the negatives of effects of this coming into the Euro-Mediterranean policy and all the blockages. Also, what it is not new is something that we are witnessing these days, and if you look at Commissioner Suica's words and the work that they are doing, we can see that, is the attempt to depoliticize Euro-Mediterranean relations. It's not about politics, it's about policies. We have to focus on energy, on health. Let's avoid the conflicting issues and let's focus on the things that bring us together. That's something also that, if you remember, Nicolas Sarkozy tried to do, and he quite failed on that. And yet, I would say that the whole idea of trying to transform the Mediterranean rather than managing remains powerful. And as I said before, it's part of the very essence of what the EU is supposed to do in international affairs, to transform, not just to manage the reality. This is also an element that it's being closely followed and analyzed, I would say scrutinized, by other international actors. Whatever we do on this file is being looked by others. Even people that have had responsibilities leading European member states, in that case Portugal, Antonio Guterres, in a different position, are warning the EU of the effects that this is having for the reputation of the EU. UN chief urges the EU to avoid double standards over Gaza and Ukraine. And basically we want to build partnerships That's another of the classical buzzwords in the EU with the countries and societies of our neighborhood. And yet, according to the latest polls, this is published by the Arab Center in Washington and Doha, you can see that not at the level of the United States. Here we don't have the EU, but we could take France and Germany. Remember the first image with the balcony. People tend to associate these two countries with the EU. We see that the Arab public opinion assessment on how the EU, this is a recent poll, is acting is not particularly positive. As we were discussing with Marie, that we had also to have the chance also to discuss about what it is going on right now and what may be happening in the next few days now when it comes to this logic of the policies towards the Mediterranean. That's also one of the new developments. I forgot to mention that. Commissioner Suica is not only responsible for the Mediterranean, despite this being in the title. She's also responsible for the Middle East, which includes also Iran, Iraq, Yemen. So this is important. You can say High Representative Callas, of course, she's also responsible, but the idea is that the two have to work together on this. Well, Iran has been also one of the areas where the EU was able to promote an image of herself as an actor committed with diplomacy, with multilateralism, with agreements. You may remember the picture of the signature of the JCPOA. It's true that it also started also with Javier Solana in 2009, that Cathy Ashton also took over, and that this was coordinated with Federica Mogherini. We know how this ended with the withdrawal by Donald Trump during the first presidency, but now we are in a radically different world. Iran has been discussed in the G7, but in a different manner, as we know, and Donald Trump left the meeting probably in order to prepare for something that has nothing to do with the diplomatic track, but something that may be more worrying, particularly for those that are closer and that can bring that fire that we saw in the first picture even closer to the EU. So in order for me not to end with this gloomy commentary, which again we can discuss it, and the idea for us is just to put some elements here so that we can then go deeper in any of the topics that you are more interested. I wanted to remind this because it's also important to have ideas of what has happened in the past. And this is in my city. This is 1995. That was the moment where we had the launching of the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, where family pictures of this kind were possible. So here you see the kings of Spain, and you have Yasser Arafat. Palestine was recognized as an equal member of the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, and basically this is one of the moments in which the EU had the ambition that unity despite the differences, managing the difference, but having an idea of what brings them together, and this conviction of herself of being a transformative force. Basically, if you say, are you confident, Eduard, that this could happen, that this could be the image of the new pact? Not quite. We are not there yet, but in a way that should be our expectation. As I said, not to manage and to deal with this fire that it's getting closer, but try to think also this region, this neighborhood in a different manner. How? Probably also during the Q&A we can have some ideas and to be able to brainstorm together. Thanks so much.
Can you hear me? Is the mic working? Good. So I'm afraid I'm going to actually not take a very positive note. Unfortunately, when it comes to EU-Palestine, my key point is that we've had a lot of performativity, as Edward very rightly showed us. There's been a lot of what I call rhetoric. But when we try to test this rhetoric on the ground, what we see is that the reality is very far from what the EU has presented itself. Particularly, Edward said the EU has presented itself as a transformative power. I've been working very much on the EU as a force for good and as a normative power. But unfortunately, Palestine is probably the case where the EU's legitimacy is not just nil, but probably extremely negative. So what I'm going to argue is that if the EU wants to save itself and to have any legitimacy, what it needs to do is not only to change the very vocabulary that it has been using in regards to Palestine, but more importantly, to act according to its very foundational and core principles upon which the EU itself has been built. So that's the main point. So just to start, as you all probably are very aware, the EU has been having a very consistent mantra when it comes to Palestine, and that is that there needs to be a state-building process, and that the solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and I'm using the EU's language here, is of course a two-state solution. So this has been what I call the performance. But when I look at the actual facts on the ground, what I see is that the EU has not been able to deal with some very serious, uncomfortable truths. But also primarily because the Palestinians have never been what I call present reference in the EU's diplomacy. They have always been these invisible, absent reference, and I'll explain myself as I go along. So first and foremost, you are also probably very aware that the EU is probably the single largest donor of foreign aid towards the Palestinians. And I call this hollow commitments because there's always been this kind of rhetoric that we are supporting the Palestinians, but actually what the EU has always been doing is to pay for the occupation, which has not only been there since decades, but has become even more entrenched. And my point is that the EU has been complicit in the entrenchment of violence against Palestinian human rights. So just to give some examples of what I call the performative acts, the EU has always been engaging with the Palestinian Authority as the key representative of the Palestinian people. And this includes, the usual diplomatic routines of working through public diplomacy with the representatives of the PA, as if this is some kind of normal government structure as with any other state. The EU also has its own police mission, supposedly, in Palestine, that is supposed to support the Palestinian Authority to strengthen its security and justice sectors. But in reality, although we have had a very clear plan according to the Oslo Accords of dividing the territory into A, B, and C, and although the PA is supposed to have responsibility for security in Area A, as you all know, the Israeli authorities can just go into Ramallah and basically overshadow the Palestinian Authority. So in effect, it is the occupying power that has always had the sole security might in the occupied territory. So the point that I'm trying to make is that although Oslo was celebrated as some kind of feast about the Palestinians finally having this hope for their self-determination, actually the Palestinians were never really promised a state. And the EU has never given us any clear criteria of how the supposed state-building process was supposed to come about. So in a way, the PA is this kind of notion that we pretend there is a state, we pretend we are having these diplomatic relations with the state, but in effect, it's what I call a theater of statecraft, because up to this day, no such state exists, as we all know. So what my argument is here is that the EU has continued to play along according to the occupying power script, and that means that the EU has actually in effect been not only normalizing but entrenching the status quo, which is settler colonialism. And one important historical fact is that the whole issue of Palestine is actually a problem created by Europeans. So historically, Europeans deemed the Jewish question to be one about the Jewish problem. That is how it has been referred to historically. And Jews as a community were perceived to be the Semitic people put on an equivalence with these indigenous people that were on the land called Palestine. So the notion of a partition came about through a very racial logic of putting these two groups together on this piece of land, and in this way Europe could just externalize the Jewish problem, right? So there is a foundational racial logic in which the issue of Palestine has been created. And as a very dear colleague of mine and friend, Dr. Radha Karmi, who herself comes from a family that was made forcefully displaced from Jerusalem in 1948, puts it, we can go back to the Balfour Declaration, right? And this is where it has become a European problem that was created by Europeans. And, you know, her point is that the Palestinians were never really aware of the Jewish problem for Europeans, right? So they were made to cover up for an inherent racial logic within the European vision of the Jewish community in Europe. And I don't have time to go into the detail of this, but up to this day, Palestinians are quite naive about these core racial logics that underpin the European view of the Jewish community. So perhaps just to give you some examples, one of the things that Palestinians are not aware of is that it has always remained primarily a Jewish narrative within the radar of European powers to be. So Palestinians were never really there as a focus of how can we, you know, relieve ourselves from this guilt and therefore give Palestinians what they really desire, which is the self-determination principle, right? And this came about very late. It came with the Venice Declaration in 1980, where for the first time we had a very clear European position and policy, as Eduard said, which deemed the Palestinians' right to self-determination a core foundational principle of the EU's position here. This was 1980. We never got any clear identification of how the EU was going to go about to make sure that this right was going to be fulfilled, right? So that's, again, the point I'm trying to make, that we have a lot of rhetoric, we have a lot of theater, but we never really have, you know, the actual facts on the ground of how are we going to achieve this. So there are quite a number of areas that I touch upon in the actual paper that I wrote about this. But if we think about it, the actual illegal occupation and the settler colonial enterprise has not only been entrenched, but on the one hand, if the EU talks about illegal settlements, the only thing it can come up with is to rhetorically state the increase and expansion of settlements is illegal, right? And it stops there. There is no consequence for the entrenchment of an increase in settlements, especially in the West Bank. When the Israeli authorities decided to withdraw from the Gaza Strip in 2005, what we had was still Israel deciding by sea, by air, by land, who goes in and who goes out. And as you know, Gaza was put under siege from 2007. The other ironic situation is that in 2006, after a lot of support from the EU for the Palestinians to have a democratic, election, the EU's own observation mission decided that 2006 was the most fair, free and transparent election ever, the model for the Middle East to follow. Unfortunately, those who were by a margin winning the election, Hamas, were of course not recognized by the EU. And this, I think, is pointing towards this not only double standards, as Eduard put it, but this two-face, European Union, where we say one thing, but we don't actually practice what we are preaching. And EU has invested a lot of money in what it calls democracy support, not only to the southern neighbor, but particularly on the question of Palestine, to support the Palestinian Authority, right? So when Hamas, for example, in 2006 came up with different policy recommendations and requested from the council a meeting for support to help them to know how to go about governing, because this was a social movement. So when they requested a meeting with the council, there was, of course, a quick leakage, and the council said, we do not talk to a terrorist organization, because, as you know, there was a lot of pressure on the EU to put Hamas, not just the military wing, but also the political wing, on their terrorist list. And as one council official told me, it is very easy to put either an individual or a group on this list, but it is extremely difficult to remove them from that list. So in a way, the EU locked itself up, right, between the principles and the norms that it promotes, especially in this particular case, which, as Eduard very clearly noted, is important for the whole Middle East, but also for Europe, but particularly for the rights of Palestinians, right? So the Europeans have not been neither good friends of Israel nor good friends of Palestine, because they were not really working so long, all these decades, towards peace, with the consequence that we have today. So if we, as I said, if we look historically, I don't think the EU has much to be proud of when it comes to what it has been doing in Palestine. There are other areas that I could go into. For example, the EU promoting gender equality when the rights of women and girls have not only been violated, but we have extreme forms of violence against women and girls in particular. I mean, think about what happens in Israeli prisons, sexual abuse, etc., not to mention what's been going on in the Gaza Strip since the 7th of October. So again, I am not surprised by the complete silence, what we call the deafening silence, of the EU's position, as Eduard said, as a unified whole on the extreme violations that we've been witnessing in the last 20 months. I am not surprised at all. So it's quite important to understand that at some point there will be reckoning, right? Justice will prevail. But as history has taught us, usually when there is a genocide, it takes years. I mean, think about Namibia and Germany. It was 2021 that Germany officially recognized the genocide in Namibia. So we need to think as well that the EU will not be put, in the court as of tomorrow, but as Francesca Albanese has very clearly written in her reporting, one day, even EU individuals, with particular reference in this case to von der Leyen, who, as Eduard has been saying, has been speaking on behalf of the EU, and she does not have the competence to do so, and that's why there have been even more divisions between the Council and the Parliament, who have co-decision making power, saying that the Commission has absolutely no right, particularly von der Leyen, to represent the position of the EU. So, of course, when there is the plan of entrenching settler colonialism, this kind of division of the EU plays very well into the arms of those whose interest is particularly to seize all the land of Palestine. So that's why I'm saying, the EU is no friend neither of Israel nor of Palestine, because we are witnessing what we are today, and I don't need to put that into much words. But because Maria-Louise mentioned the Danish presidency, it's quite important to mention that there is, some mobilization, some discursive shift now, even within the EU. And one important thing that happened just this morning, which I was surprised about, was that 8 out of 10 bishops in the whole of Denmark issued a press release this morning to urge the Danish government to act on behalf of the Palestinian population as a nation, right? So in a way, they're triggering the responsibility to protect, which I didn't have time to get into. But this is a norm that I don't think can apply more urgently and with great emergency as in the case of not only the Gaza Strip, but what is happening in the West Bank, but also in East Jerusalem. So voices are emerging. And I think one thing that might give the EU some room to re-establish itself as possibly a legitimate voice in the international arena, especially with what is happening now with the normative frame, is to start by thinking about changing its vocabulary, right? So we cannot talk about state building unless we actually acknowledge settler colonialism, apartheid, and now also genocide. I mean, these are quite important terms that need to enter the vocabulary of the EU if it is to promote itself as a normative power, as a force for good. And not to forget that the historical experience of France and Germany was precisely meant to be the guiding principle of the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, the Union for the Mediterranean, the neighbourhood policy, that somehow others can emulate us, our example. At the moment, I think if you ask any Palestinian, the worst example you can even imagine is to give them the EU as an example, right? So we need to start with the language, but more crucially, we need to follow up with very concrete action. And time is not only running out, it has already run out. And I think the EU will find a very hard place to find some legitimacy, particularly when we know, for instance, with regards to Iran, that the EU has been completely excluded, right? So, we see it, right? We see it there. The EU does not have the legitimacy that maybe von der Leyen thinks that the EU has. I think it's not even possible to talk about unity and diversity anymore. And maybe what might be happening, which we have already seen with regards to the critique of the EU's association agreement with Israel, is that some member states will start to build a coalition of the willing and go against the emphasis of unanimity in foreign policy and maybe push, similar others to follow suit. And this might be the way that the EU could reform itself from inside out. And that might be the way that we can discuss what the implications are for its external relations. Thank you.
Okay. Is this on? Yes? No? I unmuted it. That's a good start. Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much, Maria, for the invitation. DIIS for hosting this important discussion. I'm sure that at home we have thousands of people looking and hearing what we're talking about, because yes, this is extremely important. We've heard these brilliant presentations from Eduard and Michelle, and there is no doubt that in the region of the Middle East and the Mediterranean, we have a Europe and an EU that is not a player at this moment, and I think what I will discuss is the extent to which the EU is a player in Africa, and in particularly the Sahel region, which I've been working on. And here we have very much some of the same conclusions: lowest common denominator, coordinated action or inaction, as Eduard pointed to, and this two-phase European Union approach in the where we do see a big contrast between rhetorics and action on the ground that Michelle skillfully framed. That's also very much the case in the Sahel region. Maybe the Europeans and the EU will have more agency once the wars, because this war that also goes on right now is one, and the world that we live in today is one where military might matters, right? So maybe Europe will have more agency when it moves into a peace-building era. But here we also, fight with lowest common denominator and a two-phase approach. I will look into how this is also very much true in the region of the Sahel, which will be the focus of my presentation. I will look at how the war in Ukraine has fundamentally changed the EU's geopolitical priorities, including how and what this shift means for Europe's role in Africa and broader Europe's security actorness or agency. A few months before the war in Ukraine started, I conducted a study where I interviewed a wide range of diplomats, and both in the EU and also in the member states, and also policy makers. And at this point, there was a near unanimous agreement that the EU security effort should focus on its southern periphery. And also that the Sahel region was one of the most important intervention spaces. And then we fast forward to February 2022, when Putin invaded Ukraine, and then everything changed. EU attention and funds and personnel were from one day to the next transferred to the east, or redirected to the east. And if we take a step back and look at why the Sahel was seen at the top priority for the EU just before the world, with Europe's eyes changed, there's no doubt that at this point, and this is also why I think it's important to go back, there's no doubt that the EU saw the Sahel region as very much a test case for its so-called integrated approach, combining development and diplomacy and security, and also very much sort of the crown jewel of EU security agency. In 2011, the EU adopted its first Sahel strategy, where it was very proud about how this visioned the EU's integrated approach. And the idea was very much to now support decades of development efforts in the region, with also a stronger focus on security, but with the eyes of sort of the focus was on local security needs. And then came the coup in Mali in 2012, and then we saw following that quite a lot of EU missions, EU security missions being launched. There was the civilian EU Cap Niger that was launched in 2012, and one civilian and one military in Mali, and some other ones following that too. And these missions focused very much on long-term reform of the security sector, and classic sort of EU tools like capacity building and civilian and military training. So this sort of mirrored very much what was the EU's foreign or security policy DNA at this point in time. European security was something that the EU, exported because we had managed to create a peaceful continent in Europe for ourselves. And then after the end of the Cold War, we were pretty certain that peacetime was here to stay, and it was in this era that the EU also launched its common security and defense policy, with the purpose of promoting stability and peace for others. It had nothing to do with the protection of the European continent as such. And then came some turning points. There were at least 3 that changed this logic. This picture is from the very defining 2015 migrant crisis. Suddenly, security for the EU wasn't just about helping others. It was very much about protecting Europe's own borders too. And security and migration, we saw, became entangled. And as such, the Sahel region, from one day to the next, became no longer a place for peace building as such. It was also a place to stop migration. Another turning point was Ukraine, obviously. This brought back the spectra of territorial defense and made this idea of European independence or strategic autonomy a pressing priority. And then we had Trump 2.0 that sort of rocked the foundation of both the transatlantic alliance and also the whole sort of foundation of European security architecture that was very much based on the US coming to save us if this peace bet that we took after the end of the Cold War would turn out to be wrong. Then came Trump and exposed Europe's risky dependency on the US, right? What this meant for the EU, there's no doubt that these turning points have created a real tension that has always been there, but very much exposed now between sort of interest and values, that whole discussion, and it is undoubtedly pushing the EU to change its security actorness. Because we do have a Europe that still, and even more so these days, wants to promote those liberal values, or whatever we should call them, of human rights, governance, democracy. And the other hand, the EU still pursues internal security, strategic resources, and geopolitical clout. So, and those aims are often difficult to have both ways. They often do not go hand in hand. And of course, this shift isn't just about Ukraine or Europe or Trump. It reflects a deeper transformation of the world order as we know it. We're moving from, and we have been doing so for a while, away from a world dominated by Western norms to one that is marked by multipolar competition. We have power that is shifting, with China's economic rise, that has also been a fact for a while. Russian assertiveness, also a fact for a while. And both are very much visible in the Sahel region, where instability is rising, where trust in the West is declining and has been doing so for a while, and where these other powers are moving in. And we do also see quite a lot of growing instability in this region. In the last couple of years, since 2020, there's been 6 military coups. And yesterday I spoke with a friend who's based in, who's Danish and based in Burkina Faso, who was basically preparing to leave the country because, and this is also kind of old news, but Western diplomacy has little to do there now, was his point, because we're not welcome and it's extremely dangerous. The violence has really escalated, and we do see an extremely difficult situation that has just also within the past few years escalated. a lot. And as European presence decline, new actors steps in the Sahel region, and we have Sahelian governments that are actively encouraging this. It's a strategic choice for them to diversify partnerships because the world is changing, and the region is strategically important and no longer bound to the West. We have seen how Putin has very much doubled down on Africa in the last couple of years, and much more so since his invasion of Ukraine. And that relates to the fact that he wants basically the same in the Sahel region and other places in the world as he wants in with his war in Ukraine, namely to undermine the sort of liberal order. And his narrative of anti-colonialism fits very well with the Sahelian governments and also parts of the population. And we also have China that offers a little bit of a different way in infrastructure and investments with no strings attached, emphasizing African sovereignty and non-interference, which is something that fits very well with the new policy and approach of a new reality that we have in the Sahel. We have African leaders, and as I said, many civil society actors too, that are engaging pragmatically, and it's not a matter of them necessarily preferring Russia or China, but it's because these actors offers something else that the West and the EU doesn't, right? It's transactions without values and investments without lectures, and it's for them not about choosing the East over the West. It's about hedging bets in a world with increasing society. And here, where in a world where the liberal order is disappearing and no new order has emerged, this diversified approach seems smart, but Europe's retreat also do create a dangerous vacuum, because as we have seen, violence has gone up. And we could see a situation where insecurity could spiral. And just a few words about Europe and the EU, because Europe hasn't just left the region, right? In many cases, we have been thrown out. There is this very much growing credibility gap, as exactly as Michelle pointed out, between what the EU says and what it does. And the value argument no longer resonates because Europe and the EU can't live up to that. So that means that trust has been eroded. When I did my PhD, and I'll mention this example because my PhD supervisor is in the audience. When I did my PhD about 10 years ago about the EU's evolving security and defense policy, one of my cases was the Sahel region and the CSDP missions there. And I interviewed a lot of officials, EU officials from the mission. And this was just after or before and after the EU migrant crisis, and they explained to me how difficult it was for them to navigate this two-faced EU. And I found a quote when I prepared for this presentation, and I will end soon, Maria. This is a quote from an EU official working in one of the Sahel missions. Actually, he worked in several of them for a period of 5 years. When I started working for the EU in Mali, the focus was on the long-term perspective, aiming to help the Sahelian partners build future government structures and security institutions. And then everything changed in the summer of 2015. after the European migrant crisis, we were told to hold our horses with these long-term perspective of state reform, and change our focus to short-term activities relating to migration pressures and counterterrorism. That must have been extremely difficult. It was for EU staff, and obviously you can see how that creates distrust in the partnership. And now I will end. And I think it's really a difficult question in terms of what to do now for the EU. There's no doubt that Europe and the EU needs to rethink its interest and approach in a changing world. And it doesn't have to mean to give up on values, but it will mean to be getting real, as Michelle also pointed out. So we need to find a way to work and to also coexist with new actors in the region, and staying engaged through basic trade, de-risking, and job-creating investments. That is probably key. And on that sort of, I don't know, ambiguous note, I can see that my time is up now. Thank you so much, and I look very much forward to the discussion.
Yes, so thank you very much to all three speakers. Can I please invite you to the...
Where do you want us?
Yeah, maybe there. Should we bring the water to you? Do you need a glass of water? Yes, please. I'll see if I can... So I hope that there are questions. You have a few minutes to think. It's quite depressing. I was just checking the news just to see if there are any updates. Not yet. Obviously, there's major bombings going on, but not the big one. Please, are there any questions? Otherwise, I'll give myself the floor. Yes. And we have a microphone for you.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentations. I have a question for Christina. No. And one for Eduard. So for Christina, I will start from your ending. You said the EU has to decide how will develop its own external strategy now. You mentioned investments and all this that Draghi already talks a lot about, the competitive Europe. But at the same time, we have a very important discussion about rearmament. Mm-hmm. So what is your position on that? Can Europe become a very important player? First of all, rearmament will take very long, right? We will depend on the US for very long. So how, until we become independent, we have this autonomy, have to respond to all these challenges? And to what extent rearmament is also internally a solution? Because what the EU does internally is also related to what the EU does externally and how legitimate it is. So that's my question for Christina. And for Eduard, I really enjoyed, because I'm a policy scholar, this connection in your discussion on how the EU more and more doesn't talk about politics, but on policy. I wrote a paper on the EU as a strategic entrepreneur externally, where I look at sustainability. And I think it's very related to how the EU's role very often is related the last decades in relation to policy. But on the other hand, because of developments, like what is going on in Ukraine, what is going on at the moment in Palestine, cannot continue with this, right? It has to take a position on politics. So can you elaborate on this? Thank you.
Yeah. When you were speaking now, it reminded me a little bit of the situation of the UN, of the United Nations, where we have two United Nations. the United Nations that it's meant to do politics, and that would be the Security Council, in a way, because it's taking decisions, options, and then decide. And then you have all these UN machines doing policies, assistance, everything. I have, and this is still working while the other one had collapsed. So I have the feeling somehow that the EU, somehow, perhaps not on Ukraine, but on other topics, is going towards that direction. Sorry, again. So on the question of politics versus policies, I was saying that it reminds me a little bit of the UN, where we have these two sides, and the political part, it's kind of collapsed because of all the vetoes, because it's impossible to agree. And yet we have all this machine that it's doing policies, daily life elements that basically saves also lots of lives. In a way, when I'm thinking about the EU right now, I see that it is currently impossible to do politics together. And in that sense, I agree with what Michelle was saying, that probably the only way out is for the EU to accept that some member states will do some things together, but if we are now to wait for a compromise among all of it, it will be completely irrelevant. And yet, there is still room to do policies together. There is room to do policies together. And I like to give you, and probably that's why Commissioner Switchen on all the meetings I've been part of is putting this forward, because that's where she sees that she can do something. And that's why we are paying her in a way. Let me give you a very practical example. We have more countries that around the Middle East and North Africa that have gone through very difficult circumstances in terms of the daily life of the population. Access to electricity, potable water, basic infrastructures. There is a need in that sense for both reconstructions, the physical reconstruction and the emotional reconstruction. But even the physical reconstruction, there is something that the EU could invest a lot on. We can discuss about Gaza, and there are things about what we will do if ever there is a possibility to reconstruct Gaza, and that would be a completely different. But what about Syria? Why is there a need to wait? What about Lebanon? So there are many aspects where the EU could do, and it would be going back to basics. And this is something that I see that now in the Commission they are realizing more and more. It's not about young entrepreneurship, because which young entrepreneurship if you don't have electricity, if you don't have decent infrastructures? So in that sense, I think that this is a possible way in which we may be going, or where I expect also part of this new pact to go. But I couldn't also resist to make a comment on the part on rearmament, because here we have two different conversations, and sometimes we tend to think that it's the same, and there are two. It's about to rearm or to become more independent from the United States of America or from any other actor. Nowadays, the discussion or the mainstream seems to be about rearming with the US, because one of the goals now, perhaps not before, it's not to become more independent from the United States of America, but to make Donald Trump less mad at us, or to avoid the transatlantic divorce. And I think that this is what we are likely to see in the next days in the NATO summit, unless there is no NATO summit, because the situation derails to an extent that it is impossible to hold it. Yeah, but so we are not rearming in order to become less independent of the US. We are rearming and becoming even more dependent from the US. At least this is the direction to which we seem to be going in this moment. Mike.
Yeah. Okay, I'll unmute it. Yes, I think that you are very right, Eduard, in pointing out this super tricky balance that the EU member states are trying to strike these weeks and months following Donald Trump's much more proactive, assertive approach to foreign policy, and aggressive, going against basic norms that we that managed to come to a surprise to us once again. I see I think that if you would ask heads of states, of EU member states, they would probably be pretty content about how their diplomatic efforts that you describe here has worked, so that we probably won't see next week at the NATO summit US withdrawing from NATO. At the same time, I think that the debate has shifted significantly, and we do have European leaders that recognize the need for developing more independent action, including that of rearmament. Many of these, not to say that it will necessarily go in that direction, but we do have, as Savi pointed out, a situation where becoming autonomous would take a very long time, and it's not possible to do in a short amount of time. So we do have that space in between that needs to be filled out, and then the best approach, or at least the approach chosen by EU member states, is avoiding making Donald Trump mad. But we do also see plans, and I'm not saying that it will work or that it's going fast enough or it's the right direction to go, but we do see plans where real autonomous action, or at least towards that purpose, is framing a lot of the initiatives and strategies coming out of Brussels these weeks and months and years. At one point, we might be in a situation where it's not possible to sort of play both horses, both building our own independent action or going towards that direction, while at the same time trying to make Donald Trump happy. It is risky, we have found out, to be in someone else's faith, especially if that someone else is Donald Trump. And we could be in a situation of any day where Donald Trump forces us to choose, where you cannot play both horses. So I think that it's an extremely central and difficult debate, and it's difficult for obviously for European heads of states to find that balance, and we are not there yet. But I think from my perspective, what has changed quite recently actually is that we have a qualitative shift in the debate, where it's not only, for example, when we talk about rearmament, for a very long time, like since we talked about how it was a priority to rearm, it has been a matter of sort of the amount of money that we spend, like 2%, 3%, so on. I do see a qualitative change in that debate, where you now discuss what the money should be spent on in order to be able to defend itself. And I think that is a change worth noting.
We have time for a few more questions. Yes, and we might have a few questions depending on,
I'm Ines from the Embassy of Egypt. I have a question regarding what you have spoke about the European Commission proposal for a new pact for the Mediterranean, and that still the southern neighborhood is important for the EU. This in relation to the Danish presidency of the EU, and what has been presented throughout the last week, that now the priorities for the EU with outside world is with Turkey and with Africa. So when it speak about Africa, so they didn't mention at all the southern neighborhood. It wasn't not the government, but I mean the intellectual community and the what has been discussed in the intellectual society, that the priorities would be like for international partnership is with Turkey and with Africa. So the southern neighborhood was not on the list, and it would be only included through interest in Africa as like North African countries. So how do you see this correlation? On one side, the EU is issuing a new pact for the southern Mediterranean, while on the other side, we don't see the southern neighborhood on the priorities for the Danish presidency. So I see here a deviation.
Yeah. Again. It's a very interesting one. Probably on the cooking of the documents of the Danish presidency of the Council, I'm not fully aware of. Also note that after the Treaty of Lisbon, also the capacity of the presidency holding the Council is limited. And often in topics which are not that classical foreign policy and security, but more aspects related to energy, migration, and other aspects. But having said that, there is an important element here. The EU appoints a new commissioner for the Mediterranean. In principle, but that's not the Danish presidency, that's Ursula von der Leyen, and that's part of political discussions. The idea was to demonstrate to our partners that we care about this region, that there is a willingness to reinvest and re-engage in this region, and probably it's partly due to the reputational harm also after October 2023. But there are other elements, it's not the only one. So, but then as I said, the direction general, it's called MENA, Middle East and North Africa, and it includes the Gulf. So here there is a little bit of an asymmetry. What I can tell you, but this is probably, and it could be biased also about the places where I have been, in Italy, in Brussels, in Madrid, in France, that there seems to be a little bit of a renewed interest in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East and North Africa as such. Not only as part of an EU-Africa sister continents dimension that seemed to be very a la mode a few years ago. There is the perception that the EU cannot afford not to have a policy and to have the Mediterranean turned into this ring of fire that I was referring before. As you may know, also the commissioner has started to visit some countries, including Egypt, in the preparation of this, although there is a lot of ambiguity also about this idea of the pact. Which kind of pact? A pact among Europeans for the Mediterranean, or a pact with our Mediterranean partners about what we want to do together? Here, when you ask them, there is a lot of ambiguity. We shall know in October, because the calendar is as follows. I'm briefing you here. So the idea is that by September we will start to know the content. By October or last week of September or first week of October, most likely we will have a communication by the Commission and the External Action Service about this new pact for the Mediterranean, which then eventually will be endorsed in a Council of Foreign Affairs, but also, and this is like, wow, perhaps in a meeting of what it's called the Forum for the Mediterranean. meaning also with the countries of the southern neighborhood. That tends to happen in November. We'll see if in Barcelona or not. But then what does it mean? It means assuming the possibility of having if it is not a pact among Europeans about the Mediterranean, which is already difficult, but a pact with our Mediterranean partners, it means also that Israel is to be part of the pact. Will we collectively accept to make a pact with this Israel when we have had more than 16 member states calling for a review of the association agreement? Or will the countries from the southern Mediterranean accept to be part of the same ceremony where we stage the this pact with this Israel in this particular moment? So lots of doubts. The problem, as you can see, is that when we think about the Mediterranean, mainly from a diplomatic perspective, is problems, fatigue, is difficult, it's not going to happen. And this is why these alternative frameworks of relation sometimes gain traction. One of them was Africa. This idea of EU-Africa. Okay, and this eliminates Israel and Palestine from the equation. However, and then you can elaborate much more, but in a way the hopes that were put forward in 2019 have not translated into a big EU-Africa moment. The other one, most recent, is with the Gulf. There was the first EU-Gulf summit. There is this idea of trying to engage as much as possible with the Gulf. There is talk also about what can the EU and Turkey and the Gulf countries do for the reconstruction and stabilization of Syria. And again, question mark, we have had the countries of the Gulf saying that the ongoing events regarding Iran are extremely dangerous, and also condemning the Israeli attacks on Iran. What is going to happen? Because if we look at the statements by the French president and the German chancellor, there seems to be full backing of the Israeli positions on here. So again, even with this point, with this EU Gulf, which seemed to be like, okay, there's something new to be worked here. Perhaps if the EU appears as a follower of the line designed by Israel and the US, perhaps not even this is going to work. I don't know if I responded, because as I said, there are lots of uncertainties, but I tried to give you some elements of what it is being discussed.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, I just want to add that I'm not surprised that the Danish presidency is putting a lot of emphasis on Africa and Turkey. And I'm just going to link it with this discussion about rearmament as well. So historically, Denmark has had agency as a development actor through aid. And one of the key regions that, gives Denmark agency is Africa, right? So it was interesting that you say, amongst the intellectual milieu, because most of the funding now that has been very clearly publicized very recently is funding towards Africa, right? So there's a big campaign now for academics to focus on Africa. So this is part of your observation, which Turkey is important for Denmark, of course, because as Eduard was saying, Turkey is a very important pillar for NATO. And Denmark has always looked towards the US for its defense, alliances. But interestingly, I think regarding this rearmament discussion, Mette Frederiksen also recently made sure that when she visited Macron, there was a very clear message to Donald Trump that Europeans will stick together because of his threats regarding Greenland, right? So we have on the one hand this symbolic act of saying we are united and together, so if Trump dares to threaten Denmark again, we're going to hold firm. But when you see the actual, detail, does Europe really have the means to face up to the US, right? So I think for me, it shows the weakness again of the EU, that it's trying very hard to symbolically send a message to Trump, but actually in practice, Trump can one day wake up with a particular idea, announces it, and off he goes, right? So I think, it's very dangerous times, and I think it's not just about increasing investments and what we're going to increase, but we have to remember that European society is very concerned because all member states are re-diverting, welfare state funds into defense and armaments. And there's a big problem, across populations, across all member states, of what is happening, to welfare services. So I think there will be an even bigger gap between, the EU's legitimacy, not just externally now, but very, very importantly internally. And this, of course, plays into the far-right political parties. So I think we are in really dangerous times.
Thank you so much. We're running out of time, so Christina, do you have a final comment?
Maybe I can just say one thing about the Danish presidency priorities, because they are being published tomorrow. And what we know already at this point is that there are more or less 4 headlines. One is defense and security, and very much with a focus on rearmament and this fact that so better. Okay, so competitiveness agenda, Draghi, headline for Denmark and most other European capitals these months and years. And then a 4th point, it seems, will be migration too, where Denmark stands out a bit from the political establishment in Europe. But nevertheless, they will come tomorrow, and we will look closely to see where this discussion fits in. And going back to my sort of the point that I wanted to make in my presentation is also the risks of Europe responding so quickly to a geopolitical changing situation, where we from one day to the next turn our view towards only one thing and forget about all those other crises that are out there, right? So that's a risk in a very dangerous world. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've run out of time. Thank you for being here. Thank you to all our 3 speakers.